This is Art Bowser. I am a follower of the Comics Alternative with the two guys with PhDs, and I just love it, and I am a Patreon helper. I donate a little bit, and you should too.
This is the Comics Alternative Manga, reviews of De Wergelder, Volume 1, and The Strange Tale of Panorama Island. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Manga. I'm Derek.
And I'm Shea.
And we're two guys, one with a PhD and one who someday will get a PhD, talking about manga. And on this episode of the manga series, we're going to be looking at two works of manga. We're going to start off with a recent publication, Hiroaki Samura's De Wergelder, Volume 1, from Kodansha Press. And then after that, we're going to be looking at an older title, Suehiro Maruo's The Strange Tale of Panorama Island, which came out a couple of years ago from Last Gasp. But before we get into a discussion of those, we want to let all of you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Manga is brought to you by the incredibly wonderful, nice, friendly, and inexpensive folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some incredible specials. Now, sometimes those specials will be at 45% off cover price, sometimes 50% off of the cover price, but often the discounts are more impressive than that.
Like this month, you can get the Witchblade manga for 45% off, the Spawn manga for 45% off, and even a nice giant book of Osamu Tezuka sketches for 25% off.
So they have great manga. You got to check them out because they also have great prices. So that's Discount Comic Book Service. Their website is dcbservice.com. Go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your comics there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that Shea and Derek sent you. So, Shea, before we get into a discussion of the two titles, we should let our listeners know that this is indeed our January manga episode, although it's coming out the first week of February. Now, we didn't forget time. Shea and I had planned on doing this show the last week of February or January, and then putting it up before the end of the month. There was a complication that arose on my end. I had a family emergency in North Carolina, which is where I am now. And because of making preparations to travel and all of that, we just couldn't get a recording for the January manga show done until now, which is the second day of February. But we will be back in February, later this month, with our February manga show. It's just the first week of February, you're going to get the January show. But, getting us twice in a month is, I would hope, not a bad thing, right, Shea?
Yeah, I mean, hopefully we do our jobs well and they look at that as a blessing. But you never know. Maybe some people, they're just really salty that they didn't get a January episode in January.
Yeah, well, if you are offended by the fact that we were a little late on the January show, then, definitely send us an email and let us know that you're unhappy, that, we could have ruined someone's month, really, because if they look forward to us on a regular basis, and if they're OCD and this is part of their routine, we could have sent them off on, some kind of episode. Who knows?
Let's hope that was not the case.
Yes. But again, we apologize. We are here, though, for the January show, and we will be back later this month with the February one. But let's talk about the books for this current episode, and we're going to start with the recent publication, Die Wergelder, Volume 1, and this is published by Kodansha Comics, written by Hiroaki Samura, and if you recognize the name, it's probably because you're familiar with a title that he's much better known for, Blade of the Immortal.
Yeah, that was. I'm a big fan of Blade of the Immortal, which is why I suggested this book. For people who have read that, a lot of the stuff that happens and is featured in Die Wergelder won't be much of a surprise. But I know you weren't really familiar with his earlier work so much. So I was curious what you made of some of those very violent and very sexual parts.
Yeah, well, maybe we should tell the listeners that there's going to be quite a bit of sex, I guess, in this episode of the manga show, or at least allusions to it. Yeah, you're right. I have not read Blade of the Immortal, although I knew of it. I just have not yet gotten around to reading it. So I am coming to Hiroaki Samura as a newbie with Die Wergelder. And you asked about the violence and the sex. That really didn't bother me. It didn't shock me because I didn't think that it was over the top, especially compared to the next author that we're going to be discussing. Mm-hmm. And that didn't throw me or surprise me or have me scratching my head at all.
Because I was interested about that because there's a short kind of afterword in the book where Samura talks about kind of the genesis of the work, and he's trying to emulate the kind of pinky violence films of the 70s, which for reader or listeners who aren't aware, it's they're basically like exploitation films, primarily rape revenge movies, or what would be like in the West rape revenge movies like Thriller or I Spit on Your Grave, or Last House on the Left, stuff like that. So it is a work that's really emulative of this tradition that puts women in a position to where they're at first victims of sexual violence, but then they become these very powerful, very, very violent killers themselves. And in 2016, in a time when we're kind of, I like to think we're doing a better job of evaluating whether or not the sexual components or the sexual violence components of a lot of these narratives is necessary or even useful. I was really interested what someone who wasn't really as familiar with that tradition would make of that.
Yeah, and so are you suggesting that maybe Die Wergelder should come with trigger warning or caution?
I don't know about that. I think if someone enters into it with an understanding of kind of where it's coming from, a lot of that stuff won't seem as even surprising. And I don't think Samura, I don't think he draws it or writes it with a level of gratuity that is common in even films or television shows. Someone who watches Game of Thrones probably won't be shocked or even surprised by anything that happens here. But it is the sexual violence is very integral to the narrative. And I think that it's not just a kind of driving force of a lot of the action. It's the primary kind of driving force of a lot of the things that happen.
Right.
And I think kind of we live in a time, it's 40 years removed from the kind of heyday of a lot of the stuff that this book is drawing on. And I like to think that we are, we're willing to kind of criticize something for including sexual violence unnecessarily, or kind of meaning it includes it and it's meaningless. And I think for people who are really familiar with that, they're going to overlook that fact. When I was reading it, for me, it just seemed kind of, I had a kind of vague understanding that it was functioning in that tradition. And so I was like, of course, all this stuff happens. But by the time I got done with it, I was thinking, I have a lot of friends who they just don't really they don't read things that have that level of sexual violence because it is often gratuitous. It's unnecessary. It's very male gazy. It's alienating for women in a very obvious way. And so that kind of got me thinking, how would Derek read those components, as someone who wasn't like me, who wasn't kind of inured to those kind of plot mechanics and was so willing to overlook them and look past them. Right. Is really my question. But
yes. Now, I did not think that they were gratuitous. I do think that the sex, especially the violence that is included along with the sexual acts, or some of them in the book, could be disturbing, but they serve a purpose. They do relate to character. In other words, you really can't understand one of the main characters of this narrative, which is Nami how do we pronounce her? Savrasova, who also goes by the name of Tren. It's T-R-A umlaut N-E. Is it Tren?
So I don't know how to pronounce that either. I never know how to pronounce umlaut. So your pronunciation is the official Comics Alternative pronunciation.
Yeah, well, I don't know if you want to use my pronunciation as official, but anyway, the reason I mentioned her is that we do see her at the very beginning, and again, as I mentioned, you can't really understand her character without the sexual violence, or at least the references to that, because that makes her who she is. Now, as this story opens in the very first chapter, we see her, and she is playing the role of a prostitute. Mm-hmm. And in fact, her John is into some pretty darn kinky stuff. Mm-hmm. In fact, I'm not even sure what that stuff is wrapped in her mouth. It looks like batteries.
Mm-hmm. So it gets pretty. It gets pretty kinky, I think, is a good word to.
Yeah, I mean, this is specialized. I mean, she doesn't have just a gag in her mouth. I mean, for some reason, her John wants to wrap batteries in her mouth. I'm not sure where that's coming from, what kind of fetish we're talking about here, but it's weird. Okay. Anyway, we see this, and then what happens afterwards between her and her John? And, I don't think it's a spoiler, but I won't go into detail here. It does tell us something about who she is, but there's still a number of question marks. And as we learn more about Train, or however you pronounce her name, mm-hmm. You do learn that because of her past, when she was really young, and the situation she was in, and the rape, and the way that she was used in a variety of different ways, that has made her the person that she is now. And it also helps to explain her mission that she's on, because we don't learn about this mission until we're into the second half of this. Now, we should mention that this volume that came out in January from Kodansha, it I guess you could call it an omnibus edition, although it's not called an omnibus, but this includes the first two volumes, at least that were originally published, of Die Wergelder. And that's how this first book is divided. We should also mention that this series, at least in the original Japanese, began in 2011, and it is serialized in the manga magazine Nemesis. And I guess is it still being published?
I believe that it is still ongoing.
Okay.
Yeah. According to Wikipedia, which, could be very reliable or could be a total bunk.
Right. But, we mentioned Tren as one of the main characters, and arguably this is a narrative with three main female characters. I don't know if I'd call all of them protagonists, but it just seems the story that we see so far in this first book from Kodansha, mm-hmm. that the narrative proper revolves around these three characters. There's Tren, then there's Shinobu, and then there's Ji-Mao. And Shinobu, we meet, I believe it's in the second chapter of this book, and she is an orphan, kind of a grifter. She makes her way as best she can, and when we first meet her, she unluckily hitches her wagon to kind of a small-time crook who tries to steal from his mobster employer and gets caught along with her. And so she eventually is brought into the fold of this mob for work that they're doing. And then the third woman who this narrative seems to revolve around is a killer named Jie Mao. And I think she's Chinese, correct?
Maybe
Jimao. It's Jiemao, so Jimao.
Yeah, that was the impression I got. I don't think it's ever explicitly stated. But,
I think they do say it one place. Someone refers to her as a Chinese killer or as a Chinese woman.
Okay, I must have missed that. I know there's a lot of talk about her attire, the fact that she's dressed in what Samura refers to in the back of the book as a Chinese dress. So that was I just assumed she was Chinese. But I must have missed where it was kind of explicitly stated. But that was, that's what I would say as well. That she's Chinese.
Yeah. And she is a martial arts expert who is small, but she is very deadly. Now, there are other characters in this narrative, but it just seems to me that these are the three around which everything else is structured. Is that the way that you read it?
I think those are definitely... Those three characters are definitely positioned as the three leads, but I think Shinobu more than the others is I would say like the main protagonist. She's the one that kind of does a lot of the expository narration, and she's really the only one of the three that we get a really strong sense of interiority. I think Trane's her story does drive a lot of the action, particularly in the second half, or what would be the second book. But we never really get a good sense of what's going on in her head like we do with Shinobu.
That's right. And also, I think of the three, Shinobu is the one that readers can identify with most closely. Mm-hmm. Because with Ji Mao, I mean, we really don't get inside of her. There's a little bit at the beginning. We see her experiences with a young girl. And so we do see, when we're first introduced to her, it's almost as if we see a softer side of her. But then that changes for the rest of the narrative. And with Trene, if you pronounce the E, and it's been a long time since I've had German. And it is a German name because, some of this does take place within German contexts. We do get to learn more about her, but you're right. There's less access to her interior, what's going on with her, why she does what she does, and who really she is. But with Shinobu, I mean, she seems to be someone who, kind of a down-and-out person, but someone that is nonetheless humane, someone that we can relate to. She may do questionable things, but, not someone who is completely outside of reader's experience. Mm-hmm. So you're right. I mean, I do think that she's the one that we can identify with more. But we also get to see quite a bit of the Japanese mob or the Yakuza. Mm-hmm. And in fact, one of the things that drives this first volume of Die Wergelder is the jockeying for position of different factions, different mobs, or different families. Are they called families with the Yakuza?
I don't know, because I know in the West we tend to think of Yakuza as pretty analogous to like the Italian mafia or something like that. But from my understanding, in Japan, they're not like shadowy criminal organizations that need to use front operations to make money or to launder their money. They're pretty out and open about who they are. They have like Yakuza lifestyle magazines. They're functionally more like corporations.
Yeah, and they even as organizations, I guess, or communities, if you want to call it that, they even help out towns and communities and part of their celebrations and whatnot. Mm-hmm. So if these are, I guess, somewhat Japanese equivalent of what we call the mafia, then they're much more out in the open, and they may be just as heartless and bloody, but from what I understand, there seems to be a more human side to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're. I think it's we shouldn't think of them as families, though. I think like corporations is a better way to It's a better way to talk about them.
Yeah, that's good. But anyway, much of what drives this narrative is, the competing corporations, let's say, or these different factions of the Yakuza who are jockeying for position. And the mystery that slowly unfolds, at least to a point in this first omnibus volume, is this case, a brief case, that it becomes the point of contention between these groups and their fetuses, human fetuses, in this briefcase. And then much of what drives, especially the last half of this first omnibus, is the main characters just trying to learn, what and why. So what kind of business are some of these guys in where human fetuses are involved? And what does it mean for them now that they've become involved? Because I guess the primary Yakuza that I guess we know most about is a man by the name of Azuma. And he is a leader of, it's called the Kakeshu Gumi. So, and he's part of the Teoke Syndicate. And at the very beginning of the second volume within this omnibus, you get a character lineup, so that's what I'm reading from.
Yeah, there was I think there are some manga that you read and it's kind of easy to keep everyone straight. The names are relatively simple, but I think in this is one where once you start talking about all the different organizational names, there's like so many and the names are so long that it does become difficult to keep them straight in your head.
Yeah, and along with that, this is something else that I wanted to mention or talk with you about. I know we started off a discussion of this book with you asking me, what I thought, this being my first Samura book, of the violent sex and how that affected it. It wasn't the violent sex that really stood out to me in reading this. What did stand out was the number of moving parts that we have in the first third, at least. And much of that is the many characters that we're dealing with, the names of the organizations, the names of the characters, and even within certain Yakuza factions, there are groups within groups. And so getting all of that straight. And because you have so many characters and so many factions of the Yakuza involved, there just seemed to be a lot of different things going on in those opening chapters. And I have to tell you, I was a little confused. So maybe because of my confusion within the first couple of chapters, I didn't pay as much attention to the violent sex, or at least relatively speaking, that wasn't as much of a concern with me. I was just trying to understand, okay, so what's going on and how is this character related to another and what kind of organization and what faction and all of that. But I think after I got into the first 2 or 3 chapters, things started to come together. Because, after the first couple of chapters, I was wondering, oh my God, am I going to have to reread this multiple times to understand what's going on? So if you do, and I think both of us would recommend strongly that readers pick up Die Wergelder, the first omnibus volume, that, if you start reading this and you're a little confused at the first chapter or so, that's okay. That's probably going to be natural. Just continue reading, and a lot of this stuff will start coming together and making sense as the story unfolds.
Yeah, I mean, I can't promise that you'll be able to tell someone else, some third party, that the names of all these organizations and what they do. But like you said, once you get through the first couple chapters and the kind of broad, the plot of the overall series starts to kind of narrow its focus, it becomes very, and not that it was difficult to follow, but it becomes very clear who is doing what, who works with who, and all of those little details. Even if you can't, it's difficult to articulate them still. You kind of have a really good sense of where everything's going and all that.
Yeah, exactly. And if someone wanted to know in a nutshell what Die Wergelder is about, and I'm looking at the back cover of this volume, and it's an explanation of the word Wergelder, and it says, Wergelder, in Germanic law, the money paid by a murderer or his family to the victim's family in atonement. And so I think words like atonement and even payback go a long way of explaining what this book is about. We were talking about Tran or Trane earlier. This is where the Wergelder part of Die Wergelder seems to come into play here, in that this is her payback. This is her attempt at having at least others atone for what they've done to her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she is, like I said, her narrative, which we get a little bit of detail on, is really the driving force of that draws all these characters together, and it's you mentioned a little bit about the fetuses and stuff like that, and it becomes a really weird comic by the end.
Yes, it does. And in terms of learning about Trane's background, this takes place, and I believe it's in the second part of this volume, when Shinobu and Trane take a train together, and while they're sitting on the train, Trane tells Shinobu some of her backstory. And that's how we learn. So, and in this sense, I think that Samura does a great job of providing some kind of exposition without making it heavy-handed. And that's one of the things I really appreciated about Die Wergelder, is that as we are learning more about characters in flashbacks or backstories and what have you, that it's handled in a very natural way. In other words, it doesn't seem gratuitous that two characters are just standing around. Hey, did I ever tell you about what happened to me when I was growing up? Well, let me share that with you.
Yeah, so, I've got a. Oh, sorry.
No. So I do think that it was very natural and it fit very well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've got a friend who's reading Blade of the Immortal for the first time right now, and his kind of complaint is that some of the dialogue is kind of clunky and stuff like that. But I think Samura is, there are certain elements that he likes to return to. He likes to make pretty explicit his, kind of sexual interests, shall we say, that recur through everything I've read from him, from Blade of the Immortal to like Emerald and other stories, the book Dark Horse put out a couple years ago, and now this, and some of the artwork I've seen from him that's, from other series that have been translated or for just illustrations. There are certain elements of that I think, he has a real problem objectifying women, and I don't think he's written a story yet where sexual violence wasn't a huge component of it. So there are elements of his what he wants to talk about that I would be critical of, but I think the way he tells his story is usually very, very good. He draws exceptionally well. I think he knows how to lay out a page to maximize the kind of speed of reading and to communicate a really strong sense of visceral dynamism. And I think he paces his stories really well. There are parts of Blade of the Immortal that kind of drag, but overall, I think he's a really strong writer on a technical level, and I think that shines through in at least these first two volumes of Die Wergelder.
Yeah. Now, again, coming back to the violence and sex in this book, it's not just that which I would define as part of Samura's style, from what you've told me of Blade of the Immortal and some of his other works, and as it plays out in Die Wergelder. But there's also a bit, to a certain degree maybe, of the grotesque. And what I mean by that is the character Trane herself. Again, I don't know if it's Train or Trane. We learn that, I guess fairly early on, that she has an eye missing, and she also has one of her arms missing up to about, I guess, the elbow. And we learn how that came about. So, I mean, this is a woman who, because of her violent past, has been mutilated. And in fact, when it comes to her arm, and I won't give anything away here because this is something that we learn toward the very end of this book, she is in many ways, she is responsible for the fact that she doesn't have an arm. I think it's her left arm or right. I'm not sure, but I'm remembering the page where it kind of shows that
the arm chained to the other person where she removed it.
Yeah.
But I can't remember precisely which, so I'm going to go with the left as well.
Yeah. So, in many ways, Train is a grotesque as a character in that, she is missing an arm and she's missing an eye. Not that necessarily makes her freakish, but we learn that she has an artificial arm, and she uses multiple artificial eyes. She has a case of different eyes that she puts in for different reasons, for different disguises. And so there is something almost a little freak showish about her as a character. And I'm pretty sure you know where I'm trying to go here, because with the violence, with the erotic, and also with the grotesque, in some ways this is maybe a lighter version of what we're going to be talking about next when it comes to Suehiro Muro's Strange Tale of Panorama Island. Now, we're not there yet, but there is a little bit of Iroguro perhaps going on with De Wergelder.
Yeah, that was something I picked up on as well. I wasn't when I suggested this, I wasn't planning on making it kind of like an Iroguro themed, which for listeners who may not know what that means, it's like a Japanese transliteration of like erotic grotesque, which is was like a popular genre of woodblock prints some time ago. So I wasn't kind of planning on making that like the connection between the two, but it ended up working pretty nicely. The books ended up sitting together really well. But yeah, there's definitely a little bit of Eroguru in this book, to say the least.
Yeah. But, this does seem, though, a very thick story that Samura has going on. Not that Strange Tale of Panorama Island isn't hefty, let's say, that there's a lot to it. I mean, that there is. But because De Wergelder is a longer ongoing series, that in this first omnibus volume that we have, Samura is setting up a lot of issues that will eventually have, some of which we can see the payoff in this first volume, but then other things we can anticipate coming up again, and us finding out more about as the narrative continues in other future volumes from Kodansha. So, and that's why I think there's a lot to really sink your teeth into in volume 1 of De Wergelder.
Yeah, was this usually one of us asks the other if this is a book that they would be willing or interested in continuing reading, and I'm interested to hear if you're going to continue to keep up with the book.
Definitely. In fact, I thought about you asking me that question as I was reading this first volume. If you had asked me within the first 2 or 3 chapters if this is something that I would want to read further into, I was thinking, well, maybe not. But then once I got into that first half, finished the first half into the second, the story got me. It captured my attention, and things, as I mentioned earlier, just started to come together more. So once these narrative pieces begin to fit, not completely, but at least somewhat, where you're getting a clearer picture, I was getting a clearer picture of what was going on here, I really enjoyed this book. And so when the second omnibus volume from Kodansha comes out, I'll definitely get it. Yeah. And I think it's coming out later this year, correct?
Yeah, Kodansha usually releases 2 or so books of their series a year, so that sounds about right.
Yeah. So I'm assuming that you're going to continue this as well.
Yeah, I've never gotten the opportunity to follow a Samura series as it was kind of being published or serialized. So yeah, I'll definitely keep up with it. Hopefully, it doesn't run for as long as Blade of the Immortal, because I don't know if I want to read any comic for 30 volumes, but but yeah, I'll definitely keep up with it.
Well, Shea, it was sounding a little while ago that we were trying to make, or maybe I was trying to make a segue through Iroguro between the Wergelder and the Strange Tale of Panorama Island. So let's go ahead and get to the Strange Tale of Panorama Island. But before we do that, let's just remind our listeners that one of our sponsors of this episode is Just Coffee Co-op. Now remember, they have coffee that is 100% organic certified, fair trade, and it's shade grown. And if you go to their website, justcoffee.coop, at checkout, after you put various coffees into your shopping cart, use the coupon code COMICS. You will get 10% off of your coffee order. And remember, shipping is always free. So get your coffee and then read some manga.
That's right. Sounds like a plan to me.
And okay, so back to the manga that you and I have recently read, and this is Suehiro Maruo's The Strange Tale of Panorama Island. And I know you and I have talked about the possibility of discussing this on the podcast for several months now, and we're just now getting around to doing this.
That's right. It's one that you mentioned that you had had for a while but hadn't gotten around to reading, and it was one that I didn't have, but I had been wanting to read for quite some time. So,
right. Now, this is coming out from Last Gasp, and it's interesting. I really like Last Gasp books, but there aren't many that come out on a regular basis. And it's good that Last Gasp is still around. For those of our listeners who aren't familiar, Last Gasp is a publisher that has roots in the underground comics movement of the 1960s and 70s. So it's still around. And this volume, I think it came out in 2013, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it's either 2012 or 2013, but right around there. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, I know you knew of Suehiro Maruo before, but have you read any of his other works?
I hadn't. We were kind of talking about it earlier, but some of his work
off mic, yeah.
Yeah, some of his work is very, very hard to get at this point. So I hadn't gotten a chance to read any of it before. But, I like this podcast as an excuse to read stuff by cartoonists that I haven't gotten I've always been wanting to check out. So.
Yeah, and you mentioned some of his work being difficult to get. I mean, some other works have been translated into English, but I don't think that at least one title that we'll mention in a second is in print any longer. I mean, he just doesn't strike me as a manga creator whose work is well known or even readily available in the United States. Now, we were discussing this earlier within the context of Iroguro, and while we mentioned that Samura maybe, dances lightly maybe around Iroguro, Suehiro Maruo jumps feet first into this style. A couple of other works that I'm familiar with from Suehiro Maruo is Mr. Arashi's Amazing Freak Show, and then Ultra Gash Inferno. Okay, and I was telling you this before we started to record, Shea. If I were looking at a scale of Iroguro, right, where on one extreme of this continuum is lighter, erotic, grotesque manga, and then at the other extreme is heavy, offensive, stuff that almost kind of turns your stomach. And then on this scale, toward the lighter end, right, the light erotic, the light grotesque, I would put The Strange Tale of Panorama Island. A little further to the more harsh extreme side, you can find Mr. Arashi's Amazing Freak Show. And then close to the other end of this continuum would be Ultra Gash Inferno. And Ultra Gash Inferno is a collection of several shorter stories that Suehiro Maruo created in the past. And I do think, though, that The Strange Tale of Panorama Island is probably the most sophisticated of his work that I've read so far. I really do like Mr. Arashi's Amazing Freak Show, and as the title would suggest, it is a freak show that we're dealing with here. So the setting is a traveling freak show, and about a young girl's experience in this freak show and her experiences with the freaks. And it does get rather strange, definitely grotesque, somewhat erotic in places, but much more grotesque than anything. The stories in Ultra Gash Inferno. Oh my God. How do I describe those without getting too graphic? Okay, let me just tell you, Shea, and our listeners, some of the titles of the stories in this collection. Okay, Putrid Night, Sewer Boy, Shit Soup, The Great Masturbator, Putrid Night, Raven of Oedipus, Voyeur in the Attic. Okay, and that's not all of the stories, but I think those are the ones with titles that tell you a little bit about what to expect from this book. So if you're offended, or if you have, let's say, certain sensibilities where you can't take sex, violence, and even just gross stuff, I would stay away from Ultra Gash Inferno.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that you found kind of the Strange Tale of Panorama Island a little more refined, maybe, than Mr. Rush's Freak Show or the stuff in Ultra Gash Inferno. Do you think that has anything to do with the fact that those stories were his own creation, Maruo's own creation, whereas this Panorama Island was an adaptation of a novel by Edogawa Rampo? Do you think that the fact that it was an adaptation, that he was working from someone else's blueprint, maybe, do you think that had an effect on the final product?
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that. This is adapted from a novella that I think was published in the 1920s, and that would make sense to me, that the reason why this is relatively tame is because this is an adaptation of someone else's narrative. Now, I have not read that original novel, so I don't know what kind of liberties Suehiro Maruo has taken on this, but it definitely has that Iroguro style to it, because there are sections of the story that do get a little, I don't think too much, sexually explicit, but definitely, I don't know if I'd call it grotesque. I think a better word would be carnivalesque.
I don't know if it does get really good. There are a couple of scenes, where there's some viscera, some gore, but it's pretty tame. It's mostly the sex, I think, that is most explicit in this book. And even then, it's only for, I guess, listeners who may not be familiar with the work, the book is about a young writer who is having a difficult time making it as a writer, and he finds out his college friend died. He sees that he and his college friend look almost identical. He pretends to be the college friend.
And his college friend comes from a very wealthy family.
Yes. And he pretends to have his college friend risen from the grave. He was buried alive. I think the term is catalepsy. And then he takes his friend's money and he builds this kind of Bacchanalian magical island full of adult theme parks and orgies and feasts, and it's supposed to be a paradise. And eventually he is found out, and that's kind of it. But until you really get to the end and you start seeing those orgies, it's pretty tame on even the sexuality. But there's like a good 10, 15 pages where it does get pretty explicit.
Yeah, I guess so. And maybe I just didn't notice as much compared to the other work that we have with Maruo. But now you mentioned that Hitomi, who is the protagonist of the story, the novelist, he gets caught at the end, and I won't go into too much detail here, but I will say that the reason that he gets caught has to do with the fact that he is a writer. And so even though, as you pointed out, he wasn't a successful writer while he was alive, so to speak, it was only posthumously, again, so to speak, that his writing becomes significant and eventually leads to him getting caught. Now, when I say posthumous, so to speak, because before Hitomi can take over the identity of his college friend Komoda, he has to make sure that he is seen in the eyes of the world that he's dead. Hitomi does. So he fakes his own death. He leaves a suicide note. What he is not aware of, though, that is after his death, his editor has taken one of his works that has yet to be published and decides to publish it posthumously. And that comes back to bite him. Right.
We talked about the book, the comic being based on a novel by Edogawa Rampo. And Edogawa Rampo is actually a pseudonym that is kind of a Japanese transliteral pronunciation of Edgar Allan Poe. And Rampo was known for very similar styles with that. And I think that really comes through in that little thread where he kind of tells on himself in a way, because his theme park is a component of the novel that gets published kind of posthumously. And so I think that little detail is very, very emblematic of the kinds of things that you would see in an Edgar Allan Poe story.
Yes, and I'm glad that you mentioned the Edgar Allan Poe connection in Rampo, especially because this is definitely a Poe-esque narrative. And in fact, there are direct references to Edgar Allan Poe in the opening pages of this story. Hitomi is a big fan of Edgar Allan Poe. And at one point, when he's contemplating how he's going to make himself appear dead to everyone else and then seem to be Komoda, his friend, in essence coming back to life, he references Poe's story, The Premature Burial, as one. And it works in that way as well. Now, there's not the fear of being buried alive as there is in The Premature Burial, but you have nonetheless a variety of different elements that would define Poe's style, his Gothic style, that plays into this book. So I would say that this is kind of a Carnival-esque Edgar Allan Poe narrative in many ways. And the reason I keep coming back to this word Carnival-esque is when Hitomi, under the guise of his friend Komoda, starts to build his island. It's a very elaborate construction. We have this takes place in the 1920s. Okay. So the kind of construction that he is wanting to build, the kind of island that he's constructing, where adults can go and be amazed and be pleasured in a variety of different ways. One of those things is tunnels, tubes under the water that run underneath or around or through the island. And so this is no major undertaking. In fact, he runs through much of Komoda's fortune in constructing this island. But along with this, Hitomi goes to, I guess, the local town where Komoda's family is from, and there is a carnival or a circus there with a variety of different performers, and he says, I want to hire you guys, come to the island. And basically, they can do whatever they want to do. They perform, they eat, they have sex. They can just be themselves and do whatever. But, there's the performance element as well. And so like you would find at a carnival or a circus, there is a lot of strange, weird, outlandish performance that goes along with pleasure and consumption. And so when I say carnivalesque, I'm thinking of a world that's kind of turned upside down, but one that has a strong element of carnal enjoyment, like we get at Carnival, right? Or Mardi Gras.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good term to use in terms of describing the kind of world that Hitomi is trying to build, this fairy tale dream that never has to end. It is very much like a Mardi Gras that never has to end. But eventually it does end, unfortunately.
Yeah.
It's a pretty, I think, compared to Die Wergelder, it's a much simpler, much more straightforward narrative. But there are elements of it that are, as weird as Die Wergelder is, there are even weirder elements in The Strange Tale of Panorama Island.
Okay, well, what struck you as some of the weirder things of Panorama Island?
The island itself is so weird. It's so well, maybe not narratively it's not as weird, but I think the characters in The Strange Tale of Panorama Island are weird. Hitomi kills someone and then he buries her on an artificial island that he had constructed to replicate some symbolist painting, and he kind of gets found out because a police detective knows that is familiar with the painting, and he sees that it's out of place, and that's really like even beyond even like a Bond villain. Really, it's such a weird kind of quirk for someone to have and indulge in. That it's these are very strange characters who just want to indulge in their very strange kind of tics and obsessions and quirks, and that results in a very, very weird world where like the height of luxury is these steps that are designed to these like 100 steps that are designed as an optical illusion to appear as like 10,000 steps. Like that's the height of luxury is just a shit ton of stairs. So just stuff like that, these little details about the world that Hitomi is trying to construct. It really is this like the fantasy land of an insane person.
It is. And from what you said, a couple of things come to mind. One, you said with the stairs, and you're right, that's a scene toward the end of the novel. And that's right before that death that I think that you were referencing, which is Komodo's wife.
Yeah.
A theme of this book is the illusion of reality. What we see is not necessarily what actually is. In other words, there is a false mask or an illusion being presented. And that's basically the entire scenario that Hitomi is playing out here. I mean, he is taking on the mask of a dead man, his former friend, and creating a reality for those who knew Komoda that is completely false. And so there are a lot of things about this island that are very similar. You mentioned the stairs, there's the panorama itself, and in fact Hitomi tells Komoda's wife about the nature of the panorama and how he's used it on this island. So it creates this false sense of setting, a false sense of depth, and character as well, and which is what Hitomi is all about, this false character. And another thing that you had pointed out was that there's something very maniacal going on, kind of insane. I wanted to mention there is a lot of laughing. Ha 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 ha, and where you have ha 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 that kind of threads ribbon like through a panel or between and among panels. And it's not just the character Hitomi who's laughing, but it seems like a lot of the people who are on the island or who are experiencing the pleasures of the island are laughing in an almost maniacal, insane manner. And at times it seems very inappropriate. It's like, why are they laughing? But that doesn't matter. I think that's all part of the story, right? Because there is something a little insane about what's going on. It reminded me of the constant laughing that keeps coming up in Suehiro Maruo's other narratives, especially the kind of things that you find in the Ultra Gash Inferno stories. I mean, there's a lot of freaky laughing. Of course, there's a lot of laughing in Mr. Arashi's Amazing Freak Show as well. That just seems out of context. But again, that's part of the almost nightmarish world that we see unfolding.
It is, like, I haven't read those Maruo works, but you talking, I guess I didn't really pick up on that, but that's a really good point. And I think that that laughter and the way he draws that laughter is very similar to the kind of psychotic laughing that you might see in like a Junji Ito work where someone is driven.
Yeah, that's good.
Driven.
Yeah.
They're like they've been driven so insane that their only reaction they can have is like a gleeful one, where they don't know how to express that psychosis other than to kind of laugh at it. Or I guess the Joker is a good example. That maniacal clown that he expresses that that insanity as laughter. But that's a really good point that I don't think I had picked up on when I was reading it. But yeah, it is very inappropriate laughter, and it's very creepy.
Yeah, it is. And you mentioned the Joker, so the next time I read this book, I'm going to have Cesar Romero's laugh in my head.
That's fine. He's the best Joker.
Yeah.
So I'm totally okay with that.
Exactly. Okay, so earlier you were talking about some of the weirdness that you saw in The Strange Tale of Panorama Island. One of the weird things about this, and I don't want to give anything away because this happens at the very end of the book, and if I said too much, then it may be a spoiler. I will say, though, that there's something that happens with Hitomi at the very end of this book that seemed to me a little weird, not weird, insane, or maniacal, but weird in a narrative sense. I think the story is paced well throughout. Okay, so I think we have an appropriate amount of space where there's a slow unfolding of the premise of what Hitomi is up to, how he plays out his plan. In a very determined way. He takes the long game, right? But then at the very end, what happens after the detective discovers that, who he is, which we've already mentioned, we see what ends up happening to Hitomi. But again, I don't want to give too much away. And to me, it seems that was wrapped up very quickly. Compared to the rest of the narrative. In other words, it seemed to me to quickly fishtail. It came to a very quick conclusion to where it's almost like being in a car accident. It happens real quick, and then after it's over, you go, what just happened? And so when I got to the very end of this tale, the conclusion was so quick for me. I thought there has to be more.
I think I remember, because I had first heard about this, I think, on an episode of Comic Books Are Burning in Hell. And if I remember correctly...
Comic Books Are Burning in Hell?
Yeah. If I remember correctly, someone on that show was talking about how the original novel is...
Renpo's.
Yeah, the bulk of the narrative takes place, I guess, in what would be considered the very end of the comic, that investigation by the officer. I may be misremembering that. So that might be it, where Maruo chose to focus on the things about the narrative that interested him most, and then he had to kind of wrap it up quickly, or maybe there was a problem with serialization. But I do agree that compared to the other parts of the book, it does occur and it does get wrapped up much more quickly.
Yeah. And I don't want to say that it was an unsatisfying ending, because I think it was okay. It just was a little too quick compared to everything that had come before. So that struck me as a little unusual. And perhaps a tad imbalanced, maybe.
Yeah, I do think if it was paced a little more like the rest of the book, it would have been just a little. I don't think it makes the book bad, but I do think it detracts just a little from the overall quality of the work, and I would have liked a more satisfying ending, I guess.
Yeah. Now, again, I don't want to give away too much detail here, although I will say that this ending does involve fireworks.
Yes.
And part of the quick wrap-up is also accompanied by, at least on my part, a little confusion as to how Hitomi may have arranged what he actually does arrange, that I'm not going to give away, that involves fireworks. So I hope, dear listener, that I'm teasing you in a good way to where you want to go out and read The Strange Tale of Panorama Island, and I'm not frustrating you in not giving away the very ending of this book.
Yeah, I would definitely recommend that they go out and read it. I thought it was a pretty strong book.
Yeah, and I'm glad that we read this. It was a little strange, but then again, I guess in its own way, the Wergelder is strange too. You know, both of which we could say are examples of Iroguro, perhaps. So yeah. So
yeah,
was
it?
Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to ask if you had anything else you wanted to talk about The Strange Tale of Panorama Island.
No, is there anything else you would want to bring up?
No, I think we covered everything, all the weird thoughts I had about the book.
Yeah. Well, we had a very productive, both erotic and grotesque episode this month. We started off with Hiroaki Samura's Die Wergelder, Volume 1, from Kodansha Comics. And then after that, we looked at Suehiro Maruo's The Strange Tale of Panorama Island, coming out a few years ago from Last Gasp. Both of them you should definitely check out.
Yep, I second that.
And then after you've read those two titles, then you're going to be wanting to read more manga. And where to get that manga? Well, from our sponsor, Discount Comic Book Service. If you go to their website, dcbservice.com, you'll find a ton of manga at great prices. You can't go wrong with those guys. And after you do get your manga there, get in touch with us and let us know what you think about our manga series. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll see that you can leave us a voice message through SpeakPipe. It's really simple and easy to use. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way. Our phone number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
And if you want to email us, you can email the both of us at 2guys@comicsalternative.com. You can email me directly at Shea@comicsalternative.com. And Derek, where can they email you?
Derek@comicsalternative.com. You can also find us on a variety of social media platforms such as Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, and Pinterest. We even have our own YouTube channel, so check that out. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes, and when you do, please be sure to leave us a rating and a review. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn. But as always, you can find every single one of our episodes, as well as the reviews and the comics-related commentary that we post on our blog. And that's at our website, comicsalternative.com. So there are a lot of ways for people to get in touch with us, Shea.
As many as there are means of communication, almost.
Ah, that's right. And, you know, we get a number of people contacting me and Sean recommending webcomics, but we don't get that many people suggesting manga that we can read. So if you guys have a particular favorite, a manga title that you think that we should check out, then get in touch with us and give us the recommendation. And until next time, I'm Derek.
And I'm Shea.
We'll see you later.